called Cal State Stanislaus. And he said, well, what qualifies you to do this training? And I said, well, there's a couple of things. One, I'm getting paid. And I said, the other thing is I'm a musician. And he's like, a musician, what does that have to do with education? I said, well, what qualifies me is I'm not getting paid, but I did get water. And I've been doing this for a long time. I got interested in special ed mainly because I was teaching, and I taught high school, and I had a kid with Tourette's syndrome in one of my classes. And he was absent for a few days, which was pretty unlike him. And Friday came around, I went over to his house and I said, hey dude, what's up? Why aren't you in school? Is all okay? He said, well, I got suspended. I go, suspended? What on earth would you have done? You know, he's a great kid, no issues whatsoever behaviorally. It turns out he got suspended for disruption and defiance. And the disruption was he had an episode in one of his classes, and the defiance was he tried to explain to the teacher that he had Tourette's. The teacher should have already known this. She had an IEP for him, and if she had looked at it, she would have known. So I did a little research that didn't sound right to me, and I found out that A, he couldn't be suspended at all because he had a condition and his behavior was a manifestation of his condition, right? So he couldn't even be suspended, and he certainly couldn't have been suspended for 5 days. If he did something that warranted suspension, it would have been 2 maximum. And so, of course, I was very popular with administration when I went and started complaining about this, and then told the parents. And anyway, that's what spurred me on to learning about special education law. And over the years, I've trained judges for the Judicial Council here in California. And so I do actually, believe it or not, know what I'm talking about most of the time. And so hopefully this will benefit you. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. I have no problem being interrupted. In fact, over the course of this, I'll probably interrupt myself because I'm very ADD. So God knows where we will end up. But I promise you I'll look at a slide and know where to come back to. So are we about ready? You good? Okay. All right. So there's a few things to remember about advocacy, and before I start, let me just tell you that all of this stuff doesn't just apply to kids in care, it applies to kids. All right? Delay is the enemy. So for our kids in care, they've already lived in an abusive or neglectful situation for some time before child welfare has stepped in, right? And as a result, many of these kids have learning disabilities and or issues in school that have gone on for a significant period of time, and nobody has stepped up and done anything to address them. Either because they don't know what to do or how to do it, or just because they aren't. So when you delay, you're delaying further this kid's lack of progress. All right? So my suggestion to you is if you get a case and you see a pattern of behavior, and when I say a pattern of behavior, I'm saying grades primarily, and you see, you know, especially like with any kind of standardized testing where they're below basic or far below basic or even at basic, not proficient, that should tell you something. Now, it may be the environment that's holding them back, but more than likely there's something else going on, whether it's trauma, or a specific learning disability, or something that warrants something called a 504 plan, which we'll get into. Document everything. If it isn't written down, it doesn't exist. And as an advocate, you have an obligation to the court to document everything, and you also have an obligation to your program. And there's a couple of reasons. On the program side, our program, a lot of our funding comes through grants. Right? And so if we can't document the efforts that our advocates are making, we can't get money from foundations to support our program. We have to be able to prove on some level that we have measurable outcomes and measurable efforts. So it's very important from a financial side. From the court side, when you write your court report and you submit your court report, and somebody is looking at a report that may be critical of what's gone on, whether it's in a home or with the agency or some other circumstance, you need to be able to support what you're claiming in your report. And the best way to do that is through your own notes. So you want to document everything. It is rare, but there are occasions where your notes may be subpoenaed to provide to counsel and to the judge. And there's nothing worse than providing a series of court reports with absolutely nothing written down to back them up, right? Know who holds ed rights. Education rights is an extremely important issue. You need to know who holds them. And the first thing you want to do when you get a case is ask the social worker, who holds ed rights for this kid or these children? Because that's the person who legally can make educational decisions. All right? So, if it's the biological parents who hold the education rights, you need to know. There's actually a decent chance that nobody does. Because a lot of times our parents' rights are limited or terminated by the judge, and the judge has neglected to appoint a responsible adult to fulfill that role. Legally, they have to. All right? But you want to know that going in. The other thing you want to consider in our program, probably about 60 to 70% of our cases, our advocates hold the ed rights for the children they serve. All right? So by law, a judge cannot assign ed rights to CASA. They can assign ed rights to a CASA, a specific person, but they cannot assign ed rights to an entity. All right? So you want to think about it. Are you willing to make educational decisions for a child or children you're serving? Because there's a responsibility that goes with that. Policy is not law. If I had $1 every time a school district told me their policy was X, I could retire. Oftentimes, though, their policies are incongruent with law, and law trumps their policy. So you want to know what the law is and how it affects the policy that they've stated. I'll give you a simple example. My 17-year-old son, when he was in 2nd grade, I wanted him assessed. And out of that assessment, he did not have a specific learning disability, but surprised, just like his father, he's very ADHD. And so my son, who was 7 at the time, one of the things that I knew that worked for him was constant physical movement. And something as simple as chewing gum helped him focus. So I had it written into his 504 plan that he could chew gum in class. The first thing I heard was from the school site, our policy is, right, no chewing gum. And I'm like, well, that's really great, but there's nothing in statute that says my son can't. And if it's in his plan, actually he can. And then I heard, of course, well, he'll be the only one. And I'm like, that's fine. But I suggested to his teacher, who was actually really great, that she let all of her kids utilize the same supports and interventions and accommodations my son had. Because I explained to her, I said, I'll bet you've got at least one other ADD kid in your class. And so he was able to chew gum, and as were all of his peers. And among other things, that was one of the modifications and accommodations we implemented. But her scores went like way up because she had a number of kids who were not diagnosed ADD, ADHD in her classroom, and it helped them. And really, kids who need the accommodation will utilize it. Kids who don't will not. Right? If it doesn't work for them, kids are smart. If it doesn't work for them, why would they do it? Right? So they won't. The chicken or the pig? My grandfather, when he was alive, I was very close to him, and he taught me a number of things, some of which were appropriate. And one of them was this story about the chicken or the pig. So I'm going to ask you a very simple question. It's so simple, I'll probably be met with stunned silence. All right? But we'll see how this goes. So there's 2 factors to a bacon and egg breakfast. What are they? Bacon and eggs. Very good. Bacon and eggs. All right. So in the context of the breakfast, what is the chicken doing?
Laying an egg.
Well, the chicken is laying an egg, but in relation to the breakfast, what is the chicken doing?
She keeps her life, and he does not.
Okay, but for the breakfast, what is the chicken doing?
Contributing an egg.
Contributing an egg. Very good. Donating the egg, right? So in a sense, the chicken is participating in the breakfast, right? What's the pig doing?
Dying. Yeah, sacrificing his life.
The pig is dying, right. So if the chicken is participating in the breakfast, the pig is fully committed. All right? So my goal is to turn you into a bunch of pigs, not a bunch of chickens. Because if you're going to do this work, you can't just stick your foot in the water and participate. You got to be a pig and jump in. All right? All right. Now, over the course of this, I'm going to say some things there. Do I have any teachers or former teachers? Okay. So I'm going to say some things that may aggravate you, that you may take personally. I may be talking about you, but I'm probably not. But I utilize examples of actual things that I've run into and run into even now that are really aggravating and frustrating. But if everything was so perfect, none of you would need this training, right? Because we could trust school districts and schools and individuals who work in school districts and schools to do all the things that we would hope that they would do for our kids. Sadly, many do, but some don't. So if you're going to be a good advocate, there's a few things you need to do. Create relationships. You can create good ones or bad ones. You should probably try to create good ones because that's what the world is made of, right? It's all about relationships. And if somebody likes you, they're more likely to do something for you. That said, don't sacrifice your integrity just to be liked. All right? Sometimes you have to do what you have to do. You have to be able to communicate ideas, so therefore you need to have an idea about what it is that you want to communicate. You need to prepare, you need to think about it. I like to work backwards. I like to think of what is it ultimately I want for this kid, and then work backwards from there, as opposed to thinking about where are we now and how can we get to some mythical place. I kind of like to know where the mythical place is, at least in my own mind. Know the facts and how the law applies. It's the same thing about policy and law. If you know the law, then you can apply it to the facts and you can apply it to their sometimes interesting policy. Keeping your eye on the ball is always the kid. And sometimes it's difficult not to let personalities get in the way, especially when you have a history with a specific school or school district or personnel. But you got to remember, it's all about that kid, or it should be. And really, question anything you don't understand. Adults are horrible at asking questions. They have a tendency just to think that somebody else knows more than they do because they're in a position where maybe theoretically they should. Any questions so far? Okay. Inform all parties of your role when you come into a meeting. I believe that last time around, we gave your program kind of like an introductory letter that you can give to schools that explain what a CASA does. They have it, Andy says. And so that'll give you kind of good footing, and maybe read it yourself so that you understand what it is that you're doing. And you want to let people know what a CASA is. You're not a house. Okay? You want to know them what your role is within the court, that you're an officer of the court, that you're there to advocate for children, and to do so adequately you need access to their records. You want to make sure that that letter and your order of appointment is put in your CUME folder, so that way it stays in there, so when they move from school to school there's already some record in there that they have an advocate and there's a court order and all of that. So put the child's needs first. It's repetitive, but worth remembering. And really, at the bottom here, it all kind of is common sense information. You need to be able to find common ground often with people. Don't mirror Congress, please. There's plenty of common ground because, in theory, everybody wants what's best for that kid. It's just a matter of getting there. Keep clear records. Be organized. With our program, we do not allow our advocates to take information home with them. So in other words, while they may be an advocate for a child, they don't get to keep their IEP at home with them when they need it. They don't get to keep all that information. It's very sensitive. Not that we don't trust you, but we don't trust anybody that knows you. All right? And we don't want somebody just arbitrarily looking through paperwork because they're curious and all of a sudden stumbling onto some poor kid's academic history or personal history. All right? In our program, we give our advocates access to everything they need. So if you need an IEP, if you're one of our advocates and you need an IEP, you'll come into the office. We'll have already redacted anything that's sensitive. It won't change anything about the IEP for your purposes, but at least we know that if you drop it at Macy's, somebody's going to pick it up and they're not going to know who we're talking about. Okay? Not that you all shop at Macy's. I don't want to make any assumptions, but keep copies of everything. Not you personally, but bring copies to your case manager so that your program has a copy of everything. Whether it's a copy of an IEP, copy of grades, attendance, behavior, whatever it is you get, bring it in so that you can make sure that your program has that on file. Keep a log. A good example of a log would be being able to show a date, who you talked to, what the conversation was about, what the next steps might be, and ultimately what happened. All right? You'll form a trail for yourself. And so when you sit down and write a court report, you'll be able to refer back to that log and see what happened and when. All right? And you'll be able to specifically, in our court reports, we list all of the contacts that we make. So sometimes those contacts are like pages long, but it's worth it for the judge to see just how much work you've been doing and who you've been talking to get the information that is in your report. When you do have a meeting, recap, make sure that you're clarifying any issues that are unclear to you. We good? Okay. So this is what my IEP pyramid, it's like the food pyramid but different. And at the bottom of the pyramid, the foundation of everything is preparation. So I'm just going to tell you, if you don't prepare, and all of these other things aren't going to matter as much as the preparation. And ultimately, excellent preparation along with all of these other things which we will go over will lead you to appropriate placement of that child. All right? But if you walk into a meeting unprepared, not knowing the history of the child, not knowing the child's needs, not knowing what some of the issues are, you're going to already be starting far behind. Special education is not a place. When I was a kid, many, many years ago, as my youngest daughter told me, I mentioned to her that she asked me, "Dad, why is it that parents treat their children like kids?" And I said, "Well, because you are a kid." She goes, "Well, I'm 14. And I said, "Yeah, I know that, but you know, when you're 40, I'll still remember holding you as a baby and holding your hand and walking in the park, and you'll still be my child. You'll still be my baby." And she said, "Well, trust me, Dad, when I'm 40, you won't remember anything because you'll be dead." Well, she does have a point, because when she's 40, I'll be 90, so I might be. I mean, if I'm still here, I'll be 90. And then I pointed out to her that her grandmother, who's 83, probably remembers things about me when I was a child, and she assured me that she probably didn't because she couldn't remember what she had for breakfast. All of those things aside, special education is not a place. When I was a kid going to school, all the kids in special education were in a building behind the gym and you never saw them, and it was like this big mystery, right? Like they were aliens from another planet. Now, kids are educated in what we call the least restrictive environment, and so you'll have a kid with a specific learning disability where they struggle in math, all right, but they're brilliant when it comes to English and reading and writing. It used to be that they'd be in a room hidden far away for their whole day. Now they're in regular mainstream classes except for in math, which is where they need the support because that's where their disability affects them. A 504 plan. How many of you have heard of a 504 before? Okay. So a 504 plan, to be eligible, it's slightly different than an IEP. You have to have a condition that substantially limits a major life activity. And What are those conditions? Well, as you can see, hearing, seeing, breathing, walking, talking, thinking is highlighted, because if you happen to be ADD or ADHD, you automatically qualify for a 504 plan if you provide a diagnosis, because your thinking is affected. And I should point out to you, not to sound too biased, because I am ADD, or as when I was a child I was ADHD. Most kids who are ADD or ADHD are brilliant. They're very, very smart. Their IQs are actually higher than the general population. It's just that because they're so smart, they get really bored really easily. So if you're ADD, you might be like wishing that you were doing anything other than just sitting here, because it's probably driving you insane. But Section 504 is tied to the Civil Rights Act of 1973. It guarantees a free, appropriate public education, or as those of us in education like to say, FAPE. The services are broad-based. They can include special education services, and they're determined by a planning team, which is like an IEP team. So what is the significant difference between the two? Well, to qualify for an IEP, you have to have a specific learning disability that's diagnosed. All right? Can you have an IEP and be also eligible for a 504 plan? It's not a rhetorical question.
Yes.
Yes. Why? Anybody want to venture a guess?
I always thought it was if the child needed medication, then you had a 504, and then the IEP was for education.
Well, not necessarily true, because there are plenty of kids who are on medications that have IEPs. That's not really a determining factor.
They can have a speech problem and need the IEP, but then they can also have breathing and walking, and that's why they need the 504.
If it's a speech problem, it's possible.
What's the difference?
What's the difference between them? I'm glad you asked. All right, there's two primary differences between a 504 and an IEP, and why a school district may choose one or the other for a kid. I'll go with the most common. Most commonly, kids who have like ADD or asthma or some other condition that would be covered by a 504, oftentimes school districts qualify them for an IEP. And they qualify them under something called OHI, or Other Health Impaired. That means that that's not a specific learning disability, but it's a factor that impacts their education and their progress, right? And why would they do that? Well, there's two reasons again. One, because 504 services are paid for out of regular education dollars. All right, and the regular education budget for a district is like this. A special education budget is like this. So they want to pay for it out of funding where there's more money. All right? The other reason, and most school personnel I don't think are aware of this, but I think district personnel certainly are. If a teacher, an administrator, a district doesn't follow a child's IEP, the ramifications, I will say, are minimal. They will tell you they're not, but in comparison, they are. So we had a school district in our jurisdiction who wasn't reassessing children for their triennial IEPs, and I'll go into the different IEPs shortly, but they weren't reassessing kids in a timely manner, and all of those kids happened to either have parents who spoke Spanish or were in foster care. All right? And when a complaint was filed with the state Department of Education, they got slapped on the wrist, and they had to do a number of different things to sort of satisfy the fact that they had not followed through on their responsibilities. Do you think anybody anywhere ever heard about this? No. The answer is no. All right? Now, if they did the same thing for kids, if they weren't providing services to kids or not following a kid's 504 plan, the ramifications are enormous, because it is tied to the Civil Rights Act of 1973. So now, by not following and willfully not following a child's 504 plan, they're violating that child's civil rights. Do you think anybody would hear about that?
Yeah.
You can bet they would. It's a big, big deal. And it's not just a big deal from an institutional point of view, it's a big deal from an individual one. Because if I'm the kid's teacher and I just refuse to follow their 504, I could be personally, civilly culpable. So I can get sued, my principal can get sued, the district can get sued, it becomes rather messy. And then of course the Office of Civil Rights comes in and they don't just look at that one kid's record, they look at everybody's records to see if there's a pattern of behavior on the side of the school district.
But they don't look at it with the other form?
With the IEPs,
Yes.
it's not the same process. And because Section 504 is tied to a civil rights legislation,
But the IEPs
the
also very important.
The IEP is very important, but the ramifications are significantly different.
That's awful.
So, the principles of both are, oh, and by the way, don't ever let a school district tell you that you can't have both. Because you can. And one of the things I'll say to you, if it doesn't say in statute that it's prohibited, you can almost always make the assumption that it's allowed. All right? And there's nothing in statute that says you cannot have both. Now, is it a duplication of services? No. Because if you have, and I have had IEPs and 504s for the same kid because they needed it for their protection. All right, so the services weren't duplicated. So let's just say you had a child with a speech impediment and they had an IEP for speech, and in the 504 it also reflected the same speech services. It doesn't mean they're getting twice as much services. It's just a duplication, basically, of paperwork. All right? It is rare that a child would require both, but it certainly has happened a few times, at least in the cases that I've had. I've advocated for 81 kids over my 10 years. And I've had it more than a handful of times because my kids were being targeted by the administration at their school. Anyway, free appropriate public education, appropriate assessment, leading to the least restrictive environment for kids. There's parent participation, and the definition of parent is pretty broad, as you will see. There's also procedural safeguards, which they should be offering you, and I'm sure they do offer them to you or the parent before every meeting. And it all leads to an IEP or a 504 plan. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So it's the same process for both of them?
No.
If I went in and I said, I've been through that with an IEP, I went in and said I needed some special accommodations, we did the IEP. But if at the same time I could have said, I'd like this to be a 504 plan? Or?
Well, we'll back up a little bit. The process is slightly different. For a 504 plan, what you need is a diagnosis. Okay. All right? So if you walk into a school and you have a diagnosis, you can have a 504 plan if it affects one of those domains. Okay. All right? For an IEP, there's assessment involved. All right? And for kids, like for instance, like in this case, if you're talking about a kid, say with ADD, like my son, all right, I wanted him assessed to eliminate a potential learning disability. I thought, I was pretty confident that he was just ADHD, which is why he was behind in his reading, because it was torture for him to, it was boring, right? Just like deathly boring for him to read a book, all right? And especially in this day and age with all this visual stimuli that kids have like 24/7. But the process for an IEP is appropriate assessment leading to a conclusion whether or not they qualify for services. Now, you still have that diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
But you may want to also eliminate learning disability or some other factor from the mix before you move forward with the plan.
So it's giving the school district to do the assessment. I walk in with the diagnosis already.
Right. The district has to do an assessment if you're requesting assessment, and there's a statutory time limit, which we'll go over. But if you're walking in with a diagnosis that says, my child is ADHD, here's a letter from their pediatrician,
Right.
you can schedule a meeting to discuss a 504 plan right then.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I would not wait till the assessment, say if you wanted assessment, I wouldn't wait for the assessment to be completed to implement a 504 plan. I would start the 504 plan now, go through the assessment process, and if it turns out that there are other factors, you can then discuss those other factors at that time, but you don't want to delay addressing a need you know already exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
And so if they had a 504 plan in the beginning and then they got an IEP, wouldn't that IEP replace the 504? They would continue to...
It could replace it. They could roll the services into an IEP. And as the person with ed rights, you could say, that works for me, I'm good with that. You could do that. Or, I mean, in most cases, you probably would do that unless you didn't have a very good relationship or didn't trust the district. Then you might say, I want to keep their 504 in place and let's also do an IEP. Yes, ma'am.
So, am I understanding you that the need to have an IEP and a 504 might be because you're getting resistance from the school and you want to make sure that the child's getting the services they need?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. And it wouldn't necessarily be resistance. It would probably be complacency. Because you'll know if you're getting resistance. Complacency is a little bit harder to diagnose. All right. We ready to move on to special education? All right. The definition of a child with a disability, the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, defines a child with a disability as a child with one of these impairments, and there are others, and who because of their disability needs special education and related services. So they have to have a disorder, and one of the basic psychological processes involved with spoken or written language or calculations. And it can manifest itself in an impaired ability or inability to listen, think, read, write, spell, or do math. Now, it is rare that a child's specific learning disability impacts the two primary domains, which is mathematical calculations and reading and writing. Usually, not always, but usually a kid is doing okay or very well in one domain and struggles in another domain. And it's because that specific learning disability affects this, but it doesn't affect that. So you'll have a voracious reader who loves to write and can't do math to save their lives, or a brilliant mathematician who can't write a paragraph. That's the simple way of putting it, and of course they affect the domains associated with those disciplines. So a strong reader is probably also going to do pretty well in history, things where there's a lot of reading and writing. A kid who's struggling in math may also struggle in science because there's some mathematics involved in science. But you can see, association, conceptualization, expression, all of those things involved can be impacted. So the term special ed basically means at no cost to the parent, a free, appropriate public education, and it's there designed to meet the unique needs of that child. So IEP is individual education plan, right? So the I, individual, it's for that kid. It's not for anybody else. You can have all sorts of training. We'll get into what travel training, which some of our kids may need, especially if they have significant cognitive impairments. Vocational education is a big deal, and it's really important for our kids because oftentimes foster youth at the age of 21 are thrown out into this world and they are on their own. So at the age of 21, they need to be able to earn a living, right? It doesn't mean they shouldn't go to college or they shouldn't extend their education, but it also means that they have to have a job. And sometimes a skilled vocational student can get a job that can support them while they're pursuing other things. Again, specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of that child resulting from their or because of their disability, and also integrating that child into the general curriculum or the least restrictive environment where possible. So here are some of the services. I list 17 of the most common ones. You can see they're kind of all over the place, and really I would say also that the services that you could provide for a child are really only limited by your team's creativity. There's really a lot of different ways to skin a cat. Not that I would skin a cat, but that's just a figure of speech. All right. Before we get into the timelines here, I want to make sure you understand, because I neglected, and I always remember this after the fact. I want to make sure you understand about what least restrictive environment is. So I'm going to ask you, since the 5 of you got stuck in the front, why don't you all stand up for me and come up here. I torture those in the back, but they're farther away. All right, come on, come on. You can come up here. All right, just line up in any way you want. Okay, so we're going to show you what least restrictive environment is utilizing these 5 volunteers. All right, we're going to go from the most restrictive environment. And I take it your name is Angela?
Yeah.
Okay, good, because otherwise I would have thought you'd rip that off of somebody. All right, so Angela is the most restrictive environment. So we're going to move you over here. Right? No, that's far enough, right here. All right, Angela is the most restrictive environment. And the most restrictive environment that you're probably going to run into is a rare case where a child or a youth has such significant behavior and emotional problems that they require a one-on-one pretty much 24/7. So Angela is a level 14 placement. And it's usually hospitalization or in a facility where that one-on-one is provided. All right? Now, you can stay right there. Hello.
Hi.
You can move right here. Okay, right there. That's far enough. We don't want you too close to Angela. All right. So, now, for a child that has behavioral issues, emotional issues, sometimes they are in what is called a non-public school. A non-public school is generally a school for kids who behaviorally just cannot function outside of a very small environment. So when we say restrictive, all right, Angela is the most restrictive because it's one-on-one, all right? Non-public setting can be anywhere from 8 to 1, 10 to 1, 12 to 1, all right? So 12 students to 1 instructor. There's usually an aide. There's usually significant behavioral supports right there on campus, right? Most of these kids are diagnosed as emotionally disturbed, all right? So you're a non-public school. Thank you. Let's move down this way. All right, no, you just can stay right there in the middle. All right, so this would be our special day class. So for our kids who have significant cognitive impairments, all right, they're usually in a special day class because they require a lot of assistance, all right? And so you may have a ratio of 6 to 1, 8 to 1, there's an aide, but these kids have some significant developmental needs. All right, so that is special day, usually on a comprehensive campus site. All right, not segregated out.
I gotta move down too?
No, you're right, you're good right here. All right, so this is our resource class. And this is where we would send a kid who has a specific issue, whether it be math or English, to make it simple for you. And so they go, let's say they have a specific learning disability that affects their ability to do math. They go to Resource for Math to get help because the ratio there is probably like 10 or 15 to 1 with an aide, and they get more one-on-one help. And it's really hyper-focused on the subject that they're going to struggle in because of their disability. And Angela here is our comprehensive classroom, our least restrictive environment, where the ratio sometimes is 35 or more to 1. But it's the general ed environment where most kids who don't have a learning disability or one of these other issues goes. Now, the kid who's in here can also come into here for the classes where they don't need specific help. We even actually can move kids who are on special day most of their time into a regular academic environment for part of the time for social reasons. All right, so you see how kids can fluctuate between these 3. Down there, they're pretty much in that environment not 24/7, although it feels like it to them. They're there the whole time. Make sense? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
You're gonna shake my hand.
All right, so I want to be aware of the time. Okay, so are you guys hanging in there okay? Yes. Okay, so far so good? All right, you can get up and leave anytime. I won't take it personally. All right, timelines. These are very important. And we're going to see how well you can do in math. And Heather, you're going to keep a log for me, okay? This will be very simple. You can do this. All right. A child is referred for assessment. When they're referred, how do we refer them for assessment?
Doctor?
In writing. Thank you. We do it in writing. You may be surprised to find out that oftentimes parents or adults go in and say, hey, I want you to refer my kid. She's struggling in X. Can you help her? Can you assess her? I want to make sure she doesn't have a learning disability. Yes, we'll get right on it.
Yeah.
And nothing happens. Exactly. Nothing happens. All right. It's in writing. And your program has an example of how to ask for assessment, the appropriate language. So let's assume for the sake of argument, Heather, that we've made this request on March 1st. All right? Can you write that down?
Yes.
March 1st. Thank you. All right. Within 15 calendar days, the district has to provide a comprehensive assessment plan in the native language of the parent. Okay, so when I say parent, I'm saying the person with ed rights. All right? Not the foster parent who doesn't have ed rights, the parent. Or, in this case, it could be the CASA who holds ed rights, or it could be an aunt, or it could be any one of a number of people. All right, it has to be prepared in the language of the parent. So if the parent speaks Spanish, what language does the assessment plan have to be in? Spanish, thank you. All right.
What if the parent doesn't have ed rights?
If the parent doesn't have ed rights, the judge should have assigned ed rights to somebody when he or she limited or terminated those rights.
Okay.
That's why we go back to what was the first question you asked the social worker?
Who has ed rights?
Who holds ed rights? Because it's not a given that the biological parent does. All right? So you can see what the assessment plan is supposed to do. So Heather, 15 days from March 1st is what date?
The 16th.
Thank you very much. Write that down, please. March 16th. So we're going to assume that the district takes the maximum amount of time here. So the parent has to give written consent for the assessment. And the parent has 15 calendar days to do so. Assume that the parent has taken the 15 calendar days. Heather, what date is it?
The 16th.
No, it was the 16th. Now they've taken 15 calendar.
17th.
No, it's not the 17th.
Depends on how many days are in the month.
Yeah.
Well, okay, March 1st. March 1st, right? Now we're on March 16th when the parent gets the plan. They take 15 calendar days. What's the date?
So they didn't 6:30.
The 31st. March 31st.
Oh yeah, Dad.
All right? So March 31st now, they return the assessment plan to the district. All right? The assessment needs to be completed within 60 calendar days. What date is it? Let's assume it's taken 60 days. What?
We're doing 60 from the 31st?
March 31st. Add 60 days. What is it? May what? May 31st. How many days total is it? 90 days. All right? 90 days. What was the very first thing that was on the first slide? Delay is the enemy. Right? Can you see why? Because even after you've requested assessment, potentially it may take 90 days, which is almost a semester. Right? And now you're going to find out if this kid does have a specific learning disability. They've gone however many years in school and another semester to find out that they require some services. Right? So that's why we don't delay. All right? Now, there's a couple of things you need to realize about assessment. There was a court case, a Supreme Court case, in fact, which ruled that districts have the right to assess children without parental consent. All right? However, they cannot provide services to those children without that parental consent. Now, I will tell you, in my, I don't know, 20-something years of doing this, I've never heard of a school district assessing a child over a parental objection. I mean, maybe it's happened. I've never heard of it. All right? So you're going to find out that when you go in and request assessment, well, I'll use my son as an example. I requested assessment for my son. He was in 2nd grade. He was deficient in reading. I figured it was because he was very ADHD, but I wanted to make sure. So the district I live in told me that I had to go to a series of meetings called SSTs. I think it was 6 exactly they said I had to attend over the course of a year. And that after that year, if everybody on the team felt it was necessary, as they put it, to assess my son, they might.
Well, oh my God.
And I asked them, I said, oh, that's interesting. Where do you get that? And they said, the law. And I said, oh, interesting. What law? Oh, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And I said, you picked the wrong parent. So you're going to hear stuff where they're going to try to delay you. Well, let us have a meeting about it. We'll have an SST and we'll implement blah, 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 and we'll do blah, blah, blah. No, I am sorry. This kid is now 14. They've been struggling in school throughout most of their life, and nobody has stepped up and done anything other than maybe had a meeting to discuss what they were going to do, and God knows if anything was done. All right? Do not take no for an answer. If you want an assessment, you get an assessment. And with our kids, assessment, I use it sometimes, like I said, as a tool to eliminate rather to include. Right? I want to know that we're not dealing with a specific learning disability so that I could sort of get pointed in a different direction. But you never really know. And our kids, a number of factors affect their education, not the least of which is trauma. So there's a lot of consideration to give, but this is important. So, evaluation. Individualized testing. It's in the native language or mode of communication of the student. So if you have a biliterate student and they're biliterate in Spanish and English, you need to determine, you can't make the assumption that it should be in English or in Spanish. You need to find out from the student, like, if you were going to be tested, what mode of communication is most comfortable for you. It's got to be reasonable. So in other words, like in Stockton, let's assume that you had a student that spoke Icelandic. All right? Now, you could fly in Bjork to translate, but if you don't know who Bjork is, this is probably just, you're going, who the heck is this guy talking about? Bjork is an Icelandic singer, for those of you who don't know. Anyway, it's not really feasible to get a translator for Icelandic in Stockton, right? But there are a number of languages, Spanish, Hmong, there's a number of them where you should expect, and the district has an obligation to provide a translator and communication in those languages. It's non-discriminatory. The tests have to be administered by trained and knowledgeable personnel. There's this, ooh, look at this. How cool. It took me almost half of this to find this. So like this is really good. So I've observed assessments before, and if I see somebody reading the owner's manual on how to do it, they're not trained or knowledgeable. The other thing is that the person who's administering the test needs to be at the IEP meeting to discuss their findings. I've actually gone to IEP meetings where the vice principal is reading a report that a psychologist prepared. And I told the vice principal, I said, you know, I know this will be hard to believe, but I actually can read. I don't need you to read this to me, but I do need the psychologist here so I can talk to them and ask them questions about their report. All right, so trained and knowledgeable. A student has to be assessed, now I'm going to use this thing all the time, assessed in all areas of suspected or potential disability. All right, kids are remarkable. They're just like human beings. And human beings do things that are fascinating. For instance, we all have a tendency to overcompensate for our weaknesses. So a lot of times with kids, you think that their greatest strength is actually what they have a disability in, as they've learned how to compensate for it. I had a young lady who had 4 forms of dyslexia and dysgraphia, and she was a straight A student. She was a straight A student because she was the most compliant, polite, nice, sweet kid who worked her tail off, but not because of her work. But she learned how to compensate for some of her shortcomings. And when we finally got her assessed and determined that she had these forms of dyslexia and dysgraphia, she went from an A student to a C student and was 100 times happier because she was getting the services she needed, right? Not just based upon how it appeared she was doing. You can have reevaluation. It would require another IEP to do so. Kids are assessed in all areas, including health, vision, hearing, although we know that most teenagers can't hear, but it's not because of a medical condition. Social and emotional status, general intelligence, etc., etc. And really, we want to look at the whole child, not just a part. So this is the criteria for emotional disturbance. And, you know, I like to find humor in almost everything. But if you guys know what a popcorn is, you know, okay, so can I just ask, can I just ask you just randomly read the STAR, the qualifying factors out loud? So one of you can, let me, maybe I need to rephrase this. I said, do you know what a popcorn thing is? And you're all nodding at me. All right, I am not serving popcorn. All right, this is a common strategy used by teachers to involve their classroom. Okay, it was common in 1963 when I was in school. All right, so each one of you randomly read the first thing there.
An inability to learn which cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors.
Next.
An inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers.
Next.
Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances exhibited in several situations.
A general persuasive mood of unhappiness or depression. Pervasive. I'm sorry, pervasive.
That's okay. We'll forgive you.
Physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems.
All right. Well, that's a teenager. Right? I mean, not to make light of it, but it really, everybody in this room would qualify for ED at some point in their life, primarily when you were between the ages of 12 and 17. All right? But this is when it's like to an nth degree. All right? Now, the other thing that you need to be aware of is that kids get misdiagnosed. I have a kid who I've been advocating for since he was 10. And he was in a non-public school, living in a group home his whole life, up until the age of 12, because he was diagnosed as emotionally disturbed. However, he wasn't. He was an Asperger's kid. Right? So kids who are autistic or who have Asperger's mirror a lot of this stuff, but they're not emotionally disturbed. They've got a different disability. Right? You've got to be very aware of the trauma our kids go through. I'm sorry, but if you were molested by your father and beaten by your mother and abandoned by both your parents, and you're now on your 12th placement, 11th social worker, and you've been in the system for 3 years, I'm sorry, but if you don't have a reaction to that, I would worry about you. Right? A lot of our kids' behaviors are in direct relation to their circumstances. That's not emotional disturbance. That's actually a healthy, normal reaction to an unhealthy, abnormal situation. So you've got to be very, very careful when you're looking at ED. This label doesn't leave kids. So the same kid who was ED at 7 and is in a placement that is now significantly different than where they were growing up, with stability, with supports, with all these things, that same kid at 24 who wants to be a police officer won't be able to, because they were diagnosed as emotionally disturbed when they were in 7. You have to be very, very careful.
Question.
Yes?
What happens to a child that has all those symptoms and doesn't end up in this emotionally disturbed classroom?
It depends on the child, and it depends on why they have those symptoms.
I can't see this child in a regular classroom. I have a CASA child in that situation, and I can't see him in a regular classroom.
Well,
It's that small environment.
he may actually be emotionally disturbed. But like my Asperger's kid, all of his behaviors sort of really mirrored an emotionally disturbed kid on some levels, but there was something about it that didn't add up. And so he happened to finally get a social worker that would work with me, and we got him reassessed, and it was clear that he was not emotionally disturbed. He was an Asperger's kid, and he had little to no social skills because he had never learned any of them. And so a lot of his behaviors, I mean, he had different behaviors, right? And that same kid, I will tell you, is in his first year at Cal State Stanislaus. I mean,
Does he have the label of emotionally disturbed?
no, we had it wiped off because we had it written in very clearly that he was misdiagnosed.
Okay, so it can be changed.
It can be changed, but you're going to go through a lot of drama, but it'll be worth it. It'll be worth it. And you know, I mean, really as an advocate, you're fighting for that child, not just for now, but you're fighting for them when they hopefully are no longer on your caseload, right? So other health impaired, like I was talking about at the beginning, about kids with ADD or ADHD, you can also qualify them for other health impaired. It has to adversely affect their performance as a student. And so right now, I think we're going to take the first of our breaks because I want to give you about 10 minutes to hit the sandbox or just get up and stretch. And so we'll be back in 10 minutes. All right.
Sorry.